Welcome to the Layman Seminary. We're continuing debate preparation for my next debate with Travis. I was going to say Travis Scott. He's a rapper. Travis Thomas. It's going to be February 4th. And so we're continuing our word study. And what we're doing is we're kind of tracing the word study done by Fred Che in his book about saving faith. And we're going to analyze things. But I want to say some things up front about word studies. When you're reading somebody and they're giving an argument, like for example, as Che's doing for his word studies, he's not going in the order of how he did the word study. He's going in the order of how he's summarizing his word study and process for his audience. And so I'll show you what I mean by that. But I just want you to see that whenever you're talking about getting to the semantic range of a word, if you're doing the word study yourself, you start with classical Greek, Little, Scott, and Jones. Then you go into the Septuagint, and that's what we're going to be focusing today as well, and how it translates the Hebrew. Then in the Koine, Moulton and Milligan for the papyri, and then New Testament usage. So you look at it, you move this way, top to down, but actually whenever you are trying to describe your results or your findings, you move from the New Testament to the Koine, the Septuagint, and so on. And that's important. And then after you do that, then you would check the meaning against the BDAG, not just go with what the BDAG says, because the BDAG could be wrong. So we're talking about the word pisteuo as it's being used in the Septuagint, and this is the Logos version of the Septuagint. And you see that the primary word that's being translated by pisteuo is aman. There's Ethiel, le Ethiel, 2 towards until 4 away from or about Ethiel, and then Shema, hear or listen, that are also some that are translated by pisteuo according to this. So this resource right here is one that Che recommends, Invitation to the Septuagint. This is the second edition for understanding how the Septuagint functions. And the Septuagint that he also is using is Ralph's Septuagint. So that's what we'll be using. So basically what he's saying is the Septuagint was the Bible of the first century. Not denying that they use Targums and all that, but we're not to that point in the study right now. And therefore, you can tell that this was their primary Bible, like when you read the book of Hebrews or Revelation, because that's what they quote or allude to, versus the few devout Pharisees that knew the Hebrew. So primarily, most people were using the version of the day, which was the Septuagint. So there's some cautions about doing Septuagint studies, because just looking at what the Septuagint says and then linking it to the New Testament is not always safe. There's got to be hermeneutical controls in place. But one thing studying the Septuagint does, it helps you get an idea of the background of the usage for the Jews at that Jewish time. Okay, so whenever I do a textual search in Logos, I'm going to search the Septuagint, which you see right here, 84 results and 84 verses. And then I come up with this right here in Logos. And we'll come back to 15:6 in a little bit. But so what you'll notice going back to the pisteuo word ring is the main word is aman, which they translate as wearing, proved to be firm, reliable, faithful, permanent, believe, or think. Then what I say here, hiphil, which is typically described as the causative stem, is not translated by it, but compounds of it are to bring out the Hebrew for us. So in other words, the hiphil form of this is not being translated by pisteuo, but there are compound words from pisteuo, like prefixes and things added to it, that are used to bring out the Hebrew force of it in the Septuagint translation. So one of the passages that Che discusses is Jeremiah 25:8, which is actually translated for Shema, which can be hear or obey. But here, I can't even remember if I included the English for this yet, so I may have to insert that later on. But this is our word, epistuosate. So this is an aorist, simple past, undefined action. But basically what he says is that most of the time that aman occurs, it's in the hiphil stem. But 2 times it occurs in the niphil stem. Niphil is passive. Okay, so here's a resource that we're going to be engaging with, the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. All right, so let me make this statement again. Theological, all right, so let's do it like this. And I'm not saying this continuum is accurate, but let's put the let me go back. Let's put the lexicons here on this side. Let's put word books here. Okay, word books. And then this would be theological dictionaries. So we talked about in a previous video about theological dictionaries that are way on this side of the continuum. These, of course, have to do with theology. So they're not just word studies. So you shouldn't use a theological dictionary like you would a lexicon. But as I mentioned in the other thing, in the other video, lexicons themselves have theology involved in them. They have presuppositions as well. Well, today we kind of got like a word book, which is sort of like a lexicon. It's a little bit more expansive, and you might say that it's dealing with the level of biblical theology and primarily, and then systematic theology. And that's just a general trend that you'll notice. But still, the thing, regardless of what end of the continuum you're at, this being more word-sided and this being more theological interpretation of it, is you have to watch out for theology and presuppositions and everything. All right, so moving forward. So inside this Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, TWOT, TWOT, you see right here that you have a discussion in aman, to confirm, support, uphold, and the cow, to be cow simple active, to be established, to be faithful, that's the niphil, the passive, and to be certain, i.e. to believe in, and that's what's in the hiphil. And so this is done by Jack Scott. And so in discussion of this, we're just going to highlight some things. He's saying that the heart of the meaning of the word for aman is the idea of certainty. Okay. The basic root idea is firmness or certainty. Remember, keep in mind what we've talked about, root fallacies and things like that. So we're just going forward with this. In the cow, it expresses the basic concept of support. The constancy involved in the verbal idea is further seen occurs in the cow only as a participle expressing continuance. And so this is something that Che talks about, is that like right here, the meaning of constancy is not coming from the verb itself. It's coming from the form of the verb, which they're assuming is indicating continuance, the participle. And so the question is, do you read that form of that part of speech into the study of the word itself? That's something to consider. In the hiphil, the causative, it basically means to cause to be certain, sure, or to be certain about, or to be reassured. Right? Because if you're causing someone to be certain, you're reassuring them. That's kind of like the idea there. To believe and show that biblical faith is an assurance. The cow participle used with a passive meaning, one who is established or one who is confirmed, i.e. a faithful one. In the niphil, participle means to be faithful, sure, dependable, and describes believers. Ahaz is told that, here's a pun going on, Ahaz is told that unless he believes, hiphil, he will not be established, niphil, i.e. without faith, he has no stability. The various derivatives reflect the same concept of certainty and dependability. This indicates that the terms so used in our prayers ought to express certainty and assurance the Lord to whom we pray. That's the amen discussion. Okay, so this is the Dictionary of Biblical Languages with semantic domains. Semantic domains are like the word ring that we saw earlier, the range of meaning that's involved. The New Testament equivalent is the little Louanida, Okay. So basically this goes beyond the idea of just a word study, but it says, okay, where's their overlap? In other words, what words take up a particular domain? Uh, and it could be where different words can describe the same domain or occur in the same domain. So you might want to think of the word domain as like where the word lives. So here's that resource, and you see that it make a reference to the TWOT. And right here you have the NIFL translation, the passive form. You have the NIFL here. You have most of these are NIFLs, right? It's kind of weird. I think Jay points it out. Why do you talk about the NIFLs first when the HIFL occurs most? If I understood him right. But here we have HIFL, believe, put faith, trust, have confidence, have faith as a believer in what God has revealed. And then, yeah, that's an expansion of it. And also, and this is one domain, and this is Louw-Nida, and where it corresponds. And this one, to believe to be true, to be confident. All right, so here's the Louw-Nida New Testament one, and this is the screenshot of that, which we've actually interacted with. So because I have these other resources open, some of my Greek stuff open, in addition to the TWOT, I'm gonna call it the TWOT, just so it don't sound like a word that some people use in a bad way. TWOT, I'll call it that. So you see that these numbers, we could go in more detail because these are going to hit on the Greek and stuff like that. Not sure what the S is, but we could go into that more detail on that. But our main focus is seeing how this resource, we're still in the, which one we still in? I think we're still in the Louw-Nida. I mean, not Louw-Nida, the semantic domain for the Old Testament one. So you go through here, and you got the definitions that are being used for Aman, and you got the NIFL there. You got confirmed, established, be sure, verified, confirmed, reliability, faith, trustworthy. Then you finally get into the HIFL right here. And then so you have these categories: stand firm, or to trust or believe. So the but neither believeth, that's a translation. A lamed, a person, trust to, believe. With the bait, a person, trust in, believe. And it gives the passages for that. And this is where the discussion of that verb form ends. So yeah. Now we have a theological dictionary of the Old Testament. So this is a theological dictionary, not a word book. And we're in discussion of this one. So you got Aman, you got the words related to it, and you got the discussion here. He starts out with etymology and everything, but we're going to zoom in to where he's talking about the HIFL. He said the problem with the HIFL form can be seen clearly by examining the various translations and explanations that have been suggested for this word. A section of some of the views that have been proposed should make the issue clear. Peterson writes, to make a man true, he amen, means the same as to rely on him. Okay, let's see, they make him true, i.e. firm, sure, and strong, to consider so firm, and thus to contribute to its firmness that make true to believe in it. But then you see Eichroyd says in several passages the word hey amen, to consider firm, trustworthy, defined to be reliable, is used to describe this positive relationship, and it does indeed very happily strike the exact note of the venturous attitude toward God. And in the footnote he adds, since the basic meaning of the root amen in Arabic is to be secure or out of danger. Now you'll remember from the previous video that either pistis or pistuo, it could be used to describe a bond. And so you kind of get this idea of security from there. And you can see that in the Hebrew as well, and even in the Aramaic. One could choose a purposeful translation is to regard as assured, to find security in. Now, this has implications for eternal security, okay? That's not my intent of the video, but just keep that in mind, that it's kind of interesting that faith itself can actually relate to security. Wiser paraphrases to say amen to something with all the consequences that this involves for an object and subject. And this also has relate to that, because whenever you believe the gospel, you're saying amen, and it has consequences that are irreversible. Eblin concludes from this, the Hiffel form aha ming has in the causative or declarative sense the meaning to let something be naaman or declare it to be naaman. That is, to let it be valid or adjudged that it corresponds to what it promises. On the other hand, Von Rand says in Hebrew, to have faith is literally to make oneself secure in Yahweh. And then it talks about Abram directed his faith is his user in the Old Testament, something in the future. Prokshik translates hey and min to become trustworthy, to become faithful. And there's a couple others I mentioned there, but this is the point. The original holy concrete meaning of the word amen is firm, reliable. Therefore, the meaning of hiffle is to be or become firm, to have or gain stability. These examples, in other words, these descriptions of how the hiffle is being used and translated and all that, this is what it says here. Oh man, I used a version of this that kind of clipped out some things, but you can still see it. These examples must suffice to indicate the varied breadth of possibility interpretations, ranging from the idea of making one sure to that of basically you have a stability in oneself. Scholars have wrapped these different meanings in the following ways: by means of etymology, which we discussed in previous videos, by considering the meaning of the hiffle, which is kind of like what we're doing now, but it says that the hiffle could be understood in different ways. So it's kind of sketchy to start with the hiffle. By varied assessment concept of faith in the Old Testament and New Testament. So in the discussion, first of all, it's necessary to examine the tenability of these three criteria. As far as deriving the meaning from the root amen is concerned, no more need to be added what's already been said above. Yeah, the root fallacy stuff. It might seem more to point to begin with the meaning of the hiffle. But when we consider what the grammars say about the meaning of the hiffle, this approach immediately becomes very questionable, because they indicated great diversity in its use. Not only is its relationship to the meaning of the root causative, to cause something to happen or to make someone do something, but it must be translated in the greatest variety of ways that the shades of meaning in the various Old Testament contexts are to be understood correctly. When Brockelman, let's see, and so it goes into that, and I'm going to another part. When Brockelman gives 6 other possibilities beside the causative meaning: to declare, to be right, to become fat, to act foolish, to obtain horns, to break out and rejoice in the cow. This shows that the classification of the hiffle in a specific category of meaning comes from the linguistic use of the hiffle in the first place, and thus that we cannot begin with this sort of classification. In other words, it's the hiffle stem that's bringing the force, not the meaning of the word. I guess that's what they're saying. The whole discussion about the meaning of the hiffle of amen, the purpose for which is to clarify, first of all, whether the hiffle here is to be understood as causative, a declarative, or an internal transitive, cannot be resolved. So those are the options for the hiffle. First, we must learn how the word was used. Then perhaps we will be in a position to determine the category in which the hiffle form, hey amen, belongs. Theoretically, it would even be conceivable that the hiffle of this word represents a special category, different from what is usually observed. Thus, the question about the grammatical classification of the hiffle of this word can be asked only at the end. Okay. With regard to the third point, the difference in he's talking about different people, and he's saying Shatler deals with the Old Testament word in appendix. He's able to define the meaning of faith in the New Testament without first dealing with the Old Testament word, because he puts it in the appendix. Then the other guy, it traces the development of it in its entirety through the Old Testament. But all this goes far beyond what is to be inferred from the linguistic use of hey amen. Our task is to determine the meaning this form has in the Old Testament. Only after we have done this will we be in a position to determine whether this meaning is related to the New Testament concept of faith, and if so, how is this related? So saying we got to deal with the Old Testament first. So it's talking about the distribution of the passages where it's occurring. It is very likely that the text of Judges 11:20 and Isaiah 20:31 should be amended. When they're talking about amended, they mean changed, and I don't like that approach. I'll just say that. I try to avoid that approach as much as possible. So I'll just keep reading. Equally important is the analysis of literary types in which I am in appears. It is found 24 times in narrative context, as well as in 4 Psalms passages, 7 times in prophetic oracles, 4 times in other Psalms, and 11 times in the wisdom literature. This very rough distribution shows that Amen is not used very often in the prophets and the Psalms, but does appear frequently in the narratives of Israel's early history and in the wisdom literature. Since the historical narratives have a predominantly theological concern and the wisdom literature has a secular concern, which what I mean is that how do you interact with the world that you're living in? It seems advisable to begin with the latter. So strictly human use in these passages, it has a negative ring. Even in the word in the book of Job, God, and so basically you have the idea that no one can be trusted. Do not believe him. God can put no trust in his servants, his holy ones. But their intention is to evaluate man as untrustworthy. So even when it says no one is pure and reliable, that God can depend on him, these statements speak of God, but their intention is to evaluate man as untrustworthy. So it gives a couple of more examples of that. It says in all these passages, hey, amen, is used when the writer wishes to state that one cannot rely on someone or something else. In these cases, it would be a frivolous, foolish undertaking against which a warning is given. So it talks about the passages in the book of Job are difficult to interpret, and part of the reason is the syntactical structure is more difficult. On the whole, the use of amen in the wisdom literature seems to be associated with a certain skepticism. However, the warnings in the book of Proverbs and the negations in Job surely make it clear that not to rely on is usually more desirable than to hasty confidence. The impression is reinforced by other passages which amen is used in a secular sense. So give some examples for that. To have confidence in a messenger, to believe in a messenger, the saying it refers to that. It can be used for do not believe him. The question in Isaiah 53 is to be understood similarly. Who has believed what we have heard? The message of the servant of God who is suffering here is incredible. It is not surprising that no one believes it. And yet in these cases, the messages were correct. People should have believed them, but they did not. After all, on whom can they rely? Thus, hey, amen here means the same thing as to consider a statement trustworthy, reliable, true, or possible. So it says, you would lose all confidence if it were told. Since Isaiah 7:9 yields a similar translation, so this translates preferred. And then you have another word, batak, that's in parallel with hey, amen. And it's often used of false security. Theological use. So he's kind of gone through the words and how it's been used in different times. The secular literature, which he means the wisdom literature. And then he goes into theological use. And it says in Exodus 4:1, but behold, they will not believe me. And indeed, when the signs are performed, the people believe. And the narrative is a somewhat different ring. In other words, there's more of a positive ring here. Exodus 14:31 led the people to believe and left no more room for doubt. So the people believed. Israel and even Moses and Aaron are often accused of unbelief and doubt. Numbers 14:11. It was a sin for the people not to believe that God was able to lead them into the promised land. So these passages talk about how they did not rely on the Lord their God. The temptation to unbelief is so great that even Moses and Aaron succumb to it. Where confidence in man is often dubious and trust in God's almost incredible promise is so difficult, it's easy to understand why positive statements are so rare. Okay. So it says these statements here on these passages so uncertain, there's no conclusion. The most astonishing then is which the author of the book of Jonah says about the Ninevites. So the translation, they believed in God. And so we're talking about Abraham's faith in a historical setting. The promise of God seriously by relying on it, to be more specific, by relying on God and by believing that he's able to fulfill his promise. So Abram reacts to the promise of Yahweh. Okay, it's talking about tzedakah, righteousness, which is originally what I was going to name my cat, but I told her why. It's like, it means righteousness, like, and she's white as snow. And she said, well, why don't we just call it Snowy? I'm like, okay. So I told my wife, I'm like, why don't you name your cat? Her, because she's got a white cat now. Why don't you name your cat Seneca? And she said, no. She says, I'll find a word for white. And so she found livna, I think it was, in the Hebrew that means white. So yeah. Anyway, back to this. Had men in their preaching and then only twice. So he's talking about the preaching to the Ninevites. The people gain confidence. If you do not gain confidence, this other word is being translated or used in those passages. This is a statement about the house of David. If you do not gain stability, you will have no stability. I understand what it's saying, but I think that the theology is going somewhere else as far as the writer. But I do agree that David should take it seriously. Okay, so in this part right here, an early interpretation in this passage is found in 2 Chronicles 20:20, where the chronicler puts a speech to the army of Judah in the mouth of King Jehoshaphat. Believe in Yahweh your God. And that was, I'm not saying that's my belief, that's this author's belief. Believe in Yahweh your God, and you will have stability. Believe his prophets, and you will succeed. That which follows in the narrative shows what is meant by belief here. Israel does nothing at all. So in other words, are we talking about passive acceptance? Or at Yahweh's inducement, the enemies destroy one another and Israel merely brings home the spoil? Wait a minute, you're talking about bringing home the spoil. So the battle belongs to the Lord, but Israel has to bring home the spoil. So you could say that this is applied activity done in faith. Here, however, Isaiah's admonition seems to have been interpreted in a very unilateral manner, in a sense of doing nothing and leaving everything to God alone. So you got that idea related to there is you should be asking, is the passage calling you to do nothing? In other words, believe God, but don't do any activity. What's going on there? So here's a summary of his arguments. Perhaps the best paraphrase that have been suggested to convey the meaning of hey and men are to gain stability, to rely on someone, to give credence to a message, or to consider it to be true, to trust in someone. Now, I'm not saying this is where you should end up. Maybe you will or not, but what you see from this is that you have the idea of assent already. To give credence to a message, or to consider it to be true, that those ideas all relate to assent in the English. I'm not talking about a census, which it also relates to. So the next resource we're going into is which is called the NIDOTTE, New International Dictionary, Old Testament Theology and Exegesis. This is the form that I have it in. So he's talking about amen, and he's talking the language of faith, belief, pistis and pistuo. He's talking about there. Then right here, concerning Genesis 15:6, about Abraham believing is counted for righteousness. The two most famous such Old Testament passages are Genesis 15:6, used by Paul in Galatians 3, Romans 4, and Habakkuk 2:4. So here's the ring for aman, which means wearing. To believe, to be faithful, to endure, to faithful, to be assured, to be confirmed, to trust, to be trustworthy, to establish, and abstractly to believe or trust. So mainly to believe as trust is the main one that's translated, and then to believe to accept is the next one. Okay, there is a sense where endure is being used for this, but we'd have to evaluate what exactly that is. So just when you do to believe to trust, you see that it's a verb to have faith, put one's trust in something. And then it gives you could call them alignments, how the Hebrew relates to the Greek. You could call them word groups, whatever you want to do. But you have batak, aman, zakar, and aman, retzak, and then you have pastuo, pepoita, and ekopisten. So when we're going into detail here about Genesis 15:6, the context is him believing about the promise of having an heir. Then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteous. Now, this is what's called, and we're going to go Hebrew, pretty deep in Hebrew right here. A vav, even though it says wav, the W is a V. Wav consecutive, meaning it's continuing the main line of the discourse in a Hiphil perfect. Okay. So this is what the NIDOTTE or whatever that how the abbreviations are says. Most famously, Abraham believed the Lord, Vahe Amen Be Adonai, and he, the Lord, credited to him as righteousness. It is notable that the verb here is a perfect with vav consecutive, which most naturally implies constant continuance in a past state. Okay. And then it uses Genesius' grammar for support for that. The point appears to be, therefore, that Abram's trust and response to God's promise in 15:4-5 is one notable example of the response to God that consistently characterized his life, evident already in Genesis 12 and 13. It is notable particularly because of God's response in the covenant that follows in 15:7-12, a covenant that becomes the basis for God's relationship with Abraham's descendants. So this is the passage. Here's 15:6 right here and 5. The thing to understand is that the blue Hebrew verbs, those are called vav consecutives, and what they're doing are vayiktos, and what they're doing is they're driving it's saying and he found, I think that's what that is. And he said, and he said, and he counted. So these are the main actions of the narrative. All the other stuff is pretty much background. So the issue is that you have, see, these are imperfects attached to a vav, the word and this is a perfect attached to there. So one term for this is these are vayiktos, and this is a wekatol, or vekatol. But we go into a little bit more detail. So there's the main line. So the question is, what's going on here? Why did it shift to the perfect? Well, the vav consecutive, perfect. So why is the shift from the imperfect to perfect? What is the causal force in the narrative is the best way to say it. So this is a Hiphil, all right? And if the Hebrew indicated Abe's faith was continuous and obedient, this is what Che was saying. Why did the Septuagint translated it as an aorist, which is just simple past or undefined action? And you can see in 15:6 that it's translated as epistuosin, which is the aorist. All right, so now we need to go into a little bit about discourse, Hebrew discourse, but this particular section is actually going to be dealing with syntax more so. So there are two levels of meaning for Hebrew verbs. Before we can discuss how verbal sequences convey specific discourse relationships, we need to understand that Hebrew verbs can convey meaning at two distinct levels. Level 1, tense, aspect, and mood. The first level is what people often mean when they speak of verbal semantics. Every verbal word, vayikto, that's the vav plus the imperfect, or wekatol, the vav plus the perfect, which is what's used in 15:6, communicates something about how the verbal action or state relates to time, tense and aspect, and reality, mood. This level focuses on the action or state of the verb represents a single unit. And then level 2 is discourse relationship. In addition to the verbal semantic level, verbal forms can also communicate something about how a clause relates to the others around it. At this level, the way verbal forms communicate discourse relates to the focus of this chapter and the next. To see how a verbal form operates on both levels, consider the vayikto form. The vayikto usually communicates past tense, perfective aspect, okay, and indicative mood. But this form also has a discourse function, usually continuing the narrative flow that is already in motion. Now, I've written a paper on Genesis 15:6, and maybe in the future I'll do a video breaking down everything that was involved there, and I will update my paper in light of anything that comes to light through this study. So in the discussion right here, the basis of tense, aspect, and mood, classic verbal semantics, tense, aspect, and mood, level 1 above, are not technically under the heading of discourse analysis. But since many students are unfamiliar with these concepts and they will come up repeatedly below, we provide a simple primer here. Tense refers to the location of a situation in time. This location is relative to some other reference point, usually the speaker's present. The most common locations are before, overlapping with, or after the reference point. Example tenses in English: past, he went; present, he goes; future, he will go. In English, there's a specific verb form for each tense idea. For example, the past tense form of a verb conveys the past tense idea. But in biblical Hebrew, there's no past tense verb. Let me repeat that again. In biblical Hebrew, there is no past tense verb. One last time. In biblical Hebrew, there's no past tense verb. Okay, because the perfect is technically not past tense, even in Hebrew. It depends on contextual issues how to understand it. Instead, biblical Hebrew conveys tense using a combination of signals, including both verb forms and contextual factors, as we discussed below. Aspect. Aspect refers to the structure of a situation in time. There are many different kinds of aspect, but the two most relevant for biblical Hebrew are perfective, in other words, completed, if you will, and imperfective, in the process, which operates from a viewpoint perspective. So think of camera angles like when you're watching a movie. Perfective aspect views a situation as undifferentiated whole. He ran to the store. Like a wide-angle camera lens, it captures an entire situation, but from a distant perspective. Imperfective aspect has the temporal progression of a situation in view. He was running to the store. It views this situation like a close-up, where the beginning and end are cropped and the action is seen as being in progress. Note that the perfective and imperfect aspect can occur in different tenses, as the table below shows in English. This is why whenever you, same thing with Greek, you got to not just think in terms of tense, but you got to think in terms of aspect and also action start. But for Hebrew, note the perfective and imperfect aspect can occur in different tenses. So remember, we have a perfect, which technically in Hebrew is not a past tense, right? And or you can have a future tense, which is the imperfect, and so that's how it shows it. But whenever you connect the imperfect with a vav, some people will call it a conversive, but that's not technically correct. But if you want to think about it in your mind, is there like the vav converts the imperfect to a perfect meaning, to a past tense meaning, then you can, that's fine. Just understand that you'll find debate about that issue. So the idea being is that the perfective aspect can be expressed with the past tense, he went, so he believed, or the future tense, he will go. Okay. But the imperfect aspect can also be described past tense, he was going, or the future tense, he will be going. And so what this is arguing is that if it's true that the perfect form of the Hiphil, the Hiphil perfect form of Genesis 15:6 for a man, faith, was trying to indicate a process, then it would have used the imperfect, okay? But it didn't. It used the perfect. So we're gonna keep going on. I'm not gonna weigh in yet on that. So this is the first year Greek grammar. I used it for Turbo Greek. I first learned Greek through Mounce's grammar in 2006. Started learning then. I started learning, and I've read several different first year grammars, but this one I read for Turbo Greek in 2016. All right, so this is a chart taken from Black's grammar. So you have time of action right here, and you have kind of action right here. So you have the imperfective aspect, which the imperfect tense, the present tense, or the future tense can convey. And you have the aoristic aspect, which the aorist, the present, and the future tense can convey. And then you have the perfective aspect, which the pluperfect, perfect, and future can convey. So just like what I showed you with Hebrew, you can't think in just terms of tense. You got to think in terms of aspect. Now, the vayikto corresponds to the imperfect, okay? But the vav actually converts it to past tense. All right. And the aorist would be correspond to the force that it has after converting, because it's just dealing with the main line. And so the perfect that's being used in the passage is kind of translated. The Septuagint uses the aorist to translate that idea, which is not a vayikto, it's a wekito. So I can't go into a lot of detail about this because I need to find more resources about it. More in particular, like I found some articles that talk about specific passages about how the Septuagint translates for the Hebrew and all that. But I just want to put some ideas in your mind. So this is in the Septuagint, and I have the mainline clauses highlighted in blue. Okay, I'm using the visual filter I have for the New Testament to indicate verbal aspect. All right, so this is just simple past background information. But notice in this one, episteusin, our passage, it's not it's treated in the same way. It's indicating the same aspect. And so I think that's one issue that we may run into, is the reason that this is a hypothesis, guys, but this is what I'm thinking. The reason the Greek Septuagint used the aorist tense was not to deny the continuous aspect of things, but because it made a choice to preserve the main line and also the secondary information. In other words, by using the aorist tense, they were able to preserve the vayikto and the wekito form, even though they may have missed something in the sense of conveying the aspect of things. So that's my assumption, that they were going more for the discourse form and function rather than determining aspect. Now, in my paper, I can't remember what I wrote and what I concluded on that, but we'll look at that in the future. But I just want you to have that idea in your mind. Okay, so let's do a little bit of review here. The Hebrew vav plus the perfect is translated by the Greek aorist undefined, not the imperfect, which would have been translated as was believing. But other options exist for the imperfect. Perhaps this wanted to preserve the main line and the most significant syntax for that. All right, so let's look at this. This is still from the NITDOTTE. I think that's how you say it. One of the points that is unclear is how this faith is to be displayed. Does it mean trusting God and keeping the powder dry? That's a military reference to gunpowder. In other words, taking appropriate military action? Or does it mean trusting God and taking no action? Generally speaking, the normal Old Testament and biblical pattern is that the former. Trusting God in this context, not a substitute for appropriate action. However, and I would argue that a lot of those passages where it's talking about that type of trust but acting, those are sanctification passages. But regardless of that, however, there are exceptional circumstances where the emphasis is entirely on trusting God and letting Him do everything that needs to be done. Israel's deliverance from Egypt at the Red Sea in Exodus 14 is a classic example. So Chase starts talking, and he's basically saying that there's some dangers that are out there concerning the word for faith. And he mentions Kenneth Gentry. I don't have access to this. I tried looking for it, don't have it. In The Great Option, A Story of the Lordship Controversy, Baptist Reformation Review, written in 1976, he says that he depends on Bultmann in certain areas for his meaning of faith. And then that allows him to carry perseverance and continued faithfulness into the meaning of pisteuo. And so that's the problem. So contextually, where the hiphil of Aman is used in the Septuagint, it can carry the concept of endurance. All right. But that's not the inherent denotation of the word. So the word itself does not mean endurance or perseverance or anything like that. It's contextually where the hiphil is being used, translated in the Septuagint for that. That's where pisteuo takes on that meaning. So it's not inherent. It's not the word itself that gives it the meaning, but its function in the sentence. So we're going to talk about 2 Kings 12:15. Here's the English passage. Moreover, they did not require an accounting from the men into whose hand they gave the money to pay to those who did the work, for they dealt faithfully. So this is one of the passages that is brought up to try to object to what I just said. Well, here's the Greek version, which is the equivalent of 4 Kingdoms 2:17, and you see right here that pistē is used right here. You can see right here the same word is translated for be and mana. So aman is being used right there for in faith. Hosea 2:20, and I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, then you will know the Lord. There it is right there in faith, in pistē, same thing, same Hebrew word being translated. But Chase says this, that it's a major error importing verbal ideas into nouns. He says that no nouns have aspectual force by definition. And I understand what he's saying here. And I could see the danger, and I can also see I know about things that are in the text and how things function. It's like, for example, when you're evaluating, and this is not a statement of whether Wallace done this right or wrong, but let's say when you're evaluating the genitive, you'll see verbal genitives and categories for those. Well, verbal genitives are going to have verbal force of some type. So, for example, a subjective genitive, makes the object the subject. And so instead of faith in God, it becomes God's faithfulness. And so in that sense, a subjective genitive has verbal force, even though it's just describing by a characteristic of God. So like I said, I understand both ideas behind this, because this brought up whenever I was researching my paper on the substantive participle, and I asked a nerdy language major group if substantive participles ever have verbal force. And I used the term verbal force, and then I clarified aspectual force and things like that. And Dr. Varner, who's at Master's Seminary, or Master's College, but he and Papa Nerd, the one that's mainly over the group, he said, he gave the example, I think, of genitives and other adverbial or verbal nouns that can have verbal force. And so it's like, all right, I'm not going to go to that extreme. So I think that needs to be weighed as we're listening to Che. Not saying Che's wrong, but there's some things that I need clarification about. And from what I've seen, I can see how verbal force can come into certain nouns. I could see places where verbs are nominalized and where nouns are verbified, if you will. So, let's move on. If there are places where perseverance is not required, or it's illogical, avoid important verbal idea into the noun. So what he's saying here is this, is that if you can find places in the Bible where you don't need perseverance as a definition, or it would be illogical to include such an idea, then this should tell you that you should avoid importing that verbal idea into the noun. So it's basically like saying take a minimal approach to the noun. Okay? Because you take a minimal approach to the verb. Because that's kind of like what he's doing, because he's basically saying it's the helpful stem in certain contexts that transforms it into having this more commitment, perseverance idea, and not necessarily even that. So it gives the example of Exodus 4:31. Here's the English. So the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord was concerned about the sons of Israel and he had seen their affliction, then they bowed low in worship. I take this passage as believing that the Israelites that Moses was talking to were saved. They may have been saved before then, but they definitely believed the message that Moses gave. So here's the Greek. You can see aorist tense. Here's the translation for the Hebrew, Vayaman. Here's the actual Hebrew. It's in the mainline clause. So we're dealing with the imperfect form there, not a perfect form. When Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So they're believing again at this point. So we see that it's translated, same Greek, same Hebrew, same aorist tense. Now it's imperfect mainline. So in chapters 15, where you have a song of commitment, in other words, a song that they're rejoicing and they're saying they're, faithful to God and all that. 3 days later, in 1524, the people grumble against Moses, right? And they're crying out. In 16:4, I will rain bread from heaven for you. So this is talking about the manna. They were complaining. And this is the results that the worms wouldn't kill it. Then Moses is interceding and pleading for them. Will they not believe in me despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst? Doesn't mean they're not saved. Pistua sinned. What's interesting here is in Numbers 14:11, this is the present tense. Will they not believe in me? And so what Che's doing is he's saying, okay, we saw in Genesis 15:6 that the aorist tense was used to translate the Hebrew perfect. Well, here the present tense is being used to translate. Let's see, where's the Hebrew? This is the present tense Greek translates the imperfect, but there's no vav attached. And so that's what's going on right there. So basically what Che's arguing is that if the intention of Genesis 15:6 was to indicate continuous action, it would have used the Hebrew imperfect instead of the Hebrew perfect. But the problem I have with that is that he's thinking in terms of the present tense and the imperfect tense. But once you put that vav on there, it has a discourse function, the main line, the vayato, the wekatal, and all that. And I think that almost suppresses the aspect of it, or the action start of it even, because the main function is at a discourse level. That's my description of things for right now. That's tentative and preliminary. Numbers 20:12. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed in me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel. Now we know Moses was saved, but he's saying he didn't believe in him, right? So Moses stopped believing in some sense. What does that mean? Well, here the aorist tense is being used to translate, you have not believed me. Notice it's got the past aspect of things going on there. So this is what we see. The word pistuo, if we look at it in the Septuagint, we have to be careful to read in the idea of continue in faith or persevere. So we shouldn't import ongoing obedience into the word. And I agree. I don't think you should, because even if you take Genesis 15:6 as understanding the ongoing obedience, it's not the meaning of the word itself that determines that it's ongoing obedience. It's how you understand the syntax and verbal aspect. And that's it for now. I'm gonna continue later on. I thought that was actually going to take longer than it did. So anyway, if you've been blessed by that video, subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell for notifications. Give us a thumbs up for the algorithm. Share it with others so they can be blessed by it. Most of all, keep this ministry in prayer. And if you feel like that God's blessed you and you would like to donate to the ministry, the PayPal link is in the About section of my channel or underneath most videos. God bless.